This is Bonnie Spring, who is amazing and one of my dearest research friends on earth. And she's going to talk about case studies of progression through stages of behavioral intervention development, which is a perfect dovetail to what Angela just talked about. So you guys must have discussed this. That's cheating. I just want to put it out there. And, oh, whoa.
What's the matter?
Well, I pulled something else up on my screen, and I was suddenly going to read you a poem instead of your CV.
That's fine. That's fine.
So I'm going to introduce Bonnie now with a little blurb that about her, but I could say other things about her. Let me see if this cuts it. Bonnie Spring is a clinical health psychologist, professor of preventive medicine, psychology, and psychiatry at Northwestern University, and director of the Institute for Public Health and Medicine's Center for Behavior and Health. That's a lot of words.
I know.
She's a director of things. She studies technology-assisted interventions to promote healthy change in multiple chronic disease risk behaviors, poor quality diet, physical inactivity. In research that has been continuously NIH funded for more than 30 years, you guys. She's my hero. She's the past president of the Society for Behavioral Medicine. She received SBM's Distinguished Scientist, Distinguished Research Mentor, Research to Practice Translation, Outstanding Optimization Research, and Distinguished Leaderships Awards, and is founding editor of its journal, Translational Behavioral Medicine, Practice, Policy, and Research. A winner of the Obesity Society's eHealth Pioneer Award and past chair of American Heart Association's Behavior Change Committee and the American Psychological Association's Board of Scientific Affairs. She is also recipient of an APA Presidential Citation for innovative research and leadership in health psychology and vision in incorporating technology into practice and training. So Bonnie is all of those things and so much more. She has moved the field forward in so many ways, and I never give a talk without quoting some of her research. Welcome to the stage, Bonnie Spring.
Oh, thank you, Donna, and I'll reimburse you later. So let me see if I can pull up my slides, which are in the wrong place. Excuse me a minute. I move us back. There we go. So, okay, can you see it? Can you see the slides? No?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, good, great, thank you.
Yes, I've just muted, so I'm like struggling to unmute.
Sorry, okay. So as you speculated, Angela and I planned this out. I think Angela just does a wonderful overview of the thinking behind the different models of how to develop an intervention. And we're doing this way this year because in prior years, particularly because people are from so many different fields, there was a feeling that we sort of jumped into the middle of things and we assumed that everybody knew all of this behavioral science and how you would go about translating it into developing some kind of a health promoting intervention. But we never really had provided much context for that. So we thought it was time to correct that. So this will be familiar to you because Angela has been talking about the stages of the multi-phase optimization strategy. And where we, of course, have to start off is in preparation, where we're trying to make sure we've got a conceptual model, try to figure out which intervention components we want to test, do pilot tests on them, and figure out how will we know when we're done? What will our optimization criteria be? And the point that I want to make is that we start in very different places in this field. And so it's worth being prepared for starting in a number of different spots. So mostly where I'll be talking today is about interventions that have a fairly decent evidence base, either for the treatment of obesity or smoking. And our problem is usually things like we need to reduce how burdensome they are, reduce the cost, reduce how long they take, reduce change what kind of population they're tailored to. But sometimes we start from nowhere. We start from a place where we just are discovering a phenomenon that's a problem, and we know it needs treatment, but we're sort of clueless about how to go about it. And so the example I wanted to give you is this syndrome called Taijin-Kyofu-Sho, which it was always considered a culture-bound syndrome confined to the Japanese population, where it characterizes about 13% of the population, mostly males. And it bears some similarity to social anxiety disorder. In social anxiety disorder, people have a tremendous fear of appearing in front of other people, eating in front of other people, being in a group, certainly giving some kind of a lecture. Usually the thing that they're afraid of is embarrassing themselves, that they will look foolish, they will look stupid, they will be judged poorly. The variant of it that appears in Japan has a different flavor. There, the concern is offending the other person, embarrassing the other person, making the other person feel uncomfortable. And so for a very long time, this was considered a unique syndrome that you really would only get out of as an outgrowth of Japanese culture. You'd have to have this very heightened concern about the other. So my former colleague, Rich McNally, who's now at Harvard, did a case study in which he found an African-American woman who seemed to have this syndrome, and she was in the US. The way it manifested was that she was afraid that when she was in the company of other people, she would look at their groin area, and that this would humiliate and embarrass them. And this was severe enough that she had been a school teacher. She could no longer teach school. She basically couldn't leave her house. And she certainly was not Japanese. She was a Southern Black woman. So the first question was, okay, what's the conceptual model for this condition? How do we even think about it? Is it a culture-bound syndrome? In which case, what is she doing with it? Or is it a form of social anxiety, and it's just taking a somewhat different flavor in this woman's case? When we think about what should be the candidate treatment components, if we're talking about a social anxiety disorder, we know some of the treatment components that are usually effective. They are cognitive behavioral treatment and desensitization. With cognitive behavioral treatment, usually what you're doing is you're trying to identify maladaptive, distorted ideas, cognitions. For example, an exaggerated belief that people are paying attention to you rather than themselves, that they can sort of read your mind and they know that you're thinking something naughty or shameful, that you have unusual features about you. So, for example, in Taijin-Kyofu-Sho, sometimes it can almost border on body dysmorphic conditions. There will be a fear that you smell bad, and this will offend people. So what goes on in the cognitive behavioral approach is that you're trying to identify those distorted ways of thinking and correct them to more rational, more sort of easy to live with beliefs. The other component that's usually used for social anxiety disorders is a behavioral treatment called desensitization, where basically what you do is you expose somebody to, starting with small degrees of similarity to the feared situation, and monitoring the person's anxiety, and gradually building up their tolerance to things that come close to being the real source of anxiety. So, for example, in this case, the woman just had to be in a room with someone sitting behind a table, which was easier for her because she couldn't look at the groin area. And they led up to gradually higher in the hierarchy. The therapist would sit with his hand on his thigh, holding up different numbers of fingers, and her job was to say what was the number of fingers. And so gradually she habituated to that. So that's how you would go about this if you were treating a social anxiety disorder. If you were treating this in Japan, the customary therapy is a treatment called Morita therapy, which is it's quite fascinating. It starts with total bed rest and isolation. Used to be for like 2 weeks. Now it's more like somewhere between 1 and 4 days. And then they gradually reintroduce light work and then heavier work. And then they may go into some relaxation therapy, some mindfulness. But part of the context is that this is considered such a social condition that the problem is that you've become isolated from your fellow community. So you need to be gradually reintegrated into it through doing work that's shared with the community. So there are very different ways of thinking about this. Now, if you were going to try de novo, having no idea, figure out how to treat this condition, you would probably want to start with pilot testing some of these components to see if it was even feasible to do them. For example, the kind of desensitization I've just described to you, I'm not at all sure I would have known it would be feasible, that the patient could tolerate it. Would she find it too offensive? Would it be acceptable to her? So you'd have some really bare bones work to do at the outset. And your optimization criteria in this case are pretty straightforward. There is no effective treatment for this that we know when it manifests in American form. So we need an effective treatment. That's what you need. And we would define that by some certain % of reduction in anxiety or avoidance. So this is preparation phase when you're starting from nothing. And sometimes you may be starting from nothing. When we turn to the case of obesity, we are far from starting at nothing. Probably our most effective behavioral treatment known in behavioral medicine is an intensive lifestyle intervention to prevent the conversion from prediabetes to frank diabetes, to overt diabetes. And this study, this behavioral intensive lifestyle intervention, was trialed against a drug that is considered the gold standard, metformin. And the lifestyle intervention it's not rocket science. It's basically that you are tracking your calories that you're consuming, your fat grams that you're consuming, and your physical activity, and you're trying to reduce your energy intake and increase your energy output, and learn something about the nutritional composition of food, so you're able to do that. What you see in these graphs is that in the landmark diabetes prevention program, which had a follow-up over 4 years, you can see that in terms of the amount of weight loss, the intensive lifestyle intervention really outshone the metformin. Placebo did nothing. Metformin did something, but lifestyle was much more effective. And then if you look at the survival curves over on the right, which show the rate of conversion over that 4-year period from pre-diabetes to diabetes, placebo obviously did the worst, metformin did somewhat better, the intensive lifestyle intervention group did by far the best. They held on in a pre-diabetic state the longest. So one thing that amazed me when I first began working in a medical school, now about 17 years ago, was that when I would talk with my physician colleagues about this diabetes prevention intervention, they would often say to me, oh, yeah, I know that trial. That's the one that showed that metformin delays the conversion from prediabetes to diabetes. I said, you know, I must have read a different study. Why is it they don't know about this intensive lifestyle intervention? And I finally began to get some understanding of what was going on when I looked at this graph in the what's my lower left-hand corner. And what it shows is the relative costs for the intensive lifestyle intervention, which was given one-on-one to an individual, versus metformin, versus the group form, a group treatment form of lifestyle interventions. And what you can see is that already in the first year of treatment, the intensive lifestyle intervention costs about $1,800. So it's pretty darn expensive. We can get the cost down if we offer it in a group format, but it's still more expensive than the metformin, which is the red line there. And when you multiply this over many years, you're looking at a treatment cost that's approaching $5,000. So I think that people know the results, but they say, look, it's not scalable. It's not realistic. We can't pay that much money. When we have a drug that it may not do as well, but at least it's affordable and scalable. So what many of us in the behavioral science arena began to do is to look at the dilemma that we face. So here we are as behavioral interventionists trying to find ways to help people improve their lifestyle so that they can avoid getting sick, rather than just treating everything medically with medication or surgically. So we want our treatments to work, and it's hard to get a behavioral treatment funded. They're expensive, the randomized controlled trials to test these things. So what tended to happen was, once we got a chance to do one of these trials, we would tend to throw in the kitchen sink. We threw in everything that we knew had some potential to work, and you get something that looks like the diabetes prevention program or its successor, the Look Ahead trial that was done with people who were already diabetic. And so you have these components like that the intervention is done by professional counselors, PhDs, MDs, advanced practice professionals. The treatment is done in person. It's done in 60-minute sessions because that's what our therapy hours were. There are a minimum of 24 to 36 treatment sessions. In Look Ahead, we provided everybody's food, all of their food. It's called meal replacement. And so, not surprisingly, the cost begins to ratchet up around $1,500 or $1,800 a year. So our problem in this case is not that we need an effective treatment. We've got an effective treatment that produces clinically meaningful 7% sustained weight loss, and it produces metabolic improvement, but it's really burdensome and it's really costly. So our challenge in this case is not needing an effective treatment, it's needing an efficient treatment. And this brings us to where I think the multiphase optimization strategy really shines. It is all about improving our interventions to the point where they're ready for prime time, and then even beyond that. It's a cycle of continual optimization because you can always make something better, more effective, more efficient. And so we now move to the blue box, the optimization phase, where we're going to encounter all of these really exciting research designs. And what I'm going to do is to walk through kind of a case study of studies that we did using 3 of these multiphase optimization strategy designs. The first one that I'll talk about is a factorial experiment. And what this is to do is you are turning on and off or turning to high and low different intervention components. So you're trying to get the best optimized average intervention for the average person. You can think of it as the best one-size-fits-all treatment to maximize the impact of the treatment at the least resource consumption. So if you think about evidence-based practice in medicine, the question is usually, okay, someone walks into your office, you don't know them, you know their diagnosis. What is the best prescription to give them that will work for most people? Not for everybody, but for most people. That's what you're trying to do when you do a factorial design to develop a behavioral intervention. We have words for this, different words in different fields. We may call what we're trying to develop an evidence-based practice. If you're a psychologist, we might call it an empirically supported treatment, but it is this best average intervention. The next thing that I'll cover after that is the SMART design. And this one is a great corrective for the factorial experiment because we know fully well that one size doesn't fit all. So the SMART design gives us the best strategy for addressing between person differences, heterogeneity in treatment response. So it helps us to figure out where should we start the treatment? What should be the first thing we do? How long should we wait to see if it's working? And if it's not working, how much should we step up? How much should we augment the treatment? You can think of this as the evidence-based practice process that comes out of the Guyot McMaster group. It's not just about finding the one best practice. It's about the cycle of finding out what is working best for this person and how you go about that. Now, the JEDI is the really exciting one, and the one that we really could not do until we had smartphones and wearable devices where they're continuously collecting big data. And the real advantage of that is that because we've got all this dense incoming information about a person, we are able to know some things about their context and what state they're in and what we need to pay attention to tailor the intervention to their current context and state. So if you think about factorials and smarts, the heterogeneity that we're dealing with is usually between people. It's, you know, if you're an anxious person, you might respond to that. If you're an extrovert, you might respond to this. But a JEDI is dealing with the fact that we're not really the same all the time. We wax in and out of states where we are more or less at risk of doing something harmful to our health and more or less receptive to an intervention. So you can think of this as dynamically personalized behavioral medicine. Okay, so let's go on now to the MOST experiment. So this is a trial called Opt-in that I did with Linda Collins, and it was pretty exciting. It was the first factorial that I think that was done in obesity. And our conceptual model was the ecological framework. And the reason that this is interesting is if you look at this slide, what we're trying to do in designing this intervention is to hit different levels of influence, of causal influence on the person. So mostly in behavioral interventions, our treatments aim to influence individual level components. So building somebody's skill at goal setting, their skill at self-monitoring, giving them feedback, giving them reminders, building their confidence, their self-efficacy. And so we do that with coaching or with text messages, reminder kinds of things. So that's where our interventions typically go. But we know that interventions usually work best if they've got some level of influence at these other levels as well. And so one that we tried to hit in Opt-in was the interpersonal level, the level of how are you doing with your family, your friends, your social network, are they supporting you? And the way that we varied this, the way that we studied this in Opt-in was we had everybody enter the trial with a support buddy. They chose their own, and we trained half of those support buddies in how to be supportive of their peer, and the others we didn't train. At the level of the organizational system, we wanted some kind of an intervention that would be embedded as close as we could get it into the healthcare delivery system. So we varied whether the person's primary care doc got a report of how they were doing in terms of their weight loss. And so some of the thinking here is, well, if you are not only trying to do this yourself, but your peers, your immediate peers are supporting your efforts to lose weight, and your primary care doc, who's seeing you pretty regularly, is supporting that, maybe you've got more oomph going into this intervention. And finally, at the most outer layer, the environment or the policy, it's really hard to change policy. I wish we could have done it in this experiment no way we could. So we made the environment a little bit easier for people by recommending that they use meal replacements and giving them a 1-week sample of these, something like Slim Fast or Jenny Craig, something like that. Okay, so what is actually going on when we're testing these different components? We call this study a screening experiment because basically we're trying to screen in components in or out, depending on whether they have an effect and at a reasonable cost. So we are trying to identify which treatment components contribute the most to either average weight loss, treated as a continuum, or to the percent of people who are achieving a public health meaningful 5% weight loss. And we're taking our primary outcome as the 6-month period, and we also want to know the cost of these components. So what does the design look like? When we're hitting the individual components, we are varying whether people are getting 12 sessions of coaching or 24, the more sort of gourmet, we're really trying to build you up here and get you into shape. Text messaging, prompts and support messages, people either get those, we turn them on or we turn them off. Same with the primary care provider, we either send them a report or we don't. We either give people recommendations to use meal replacements or we don't. And we either train the participants' self-selected buddies to be supportive or we don't. And those are 5 different intervention components we're trying to make a choice about. What everybody gets in this study is an app. And this app is just a way of trying to engage people in tracking their dietary intake and their physical activity. And so what you see here is somebody is entering in the foods that they're eating, and the app is converting them to the number of calories they've eaten, the amount of fat, how much physical activity they still need to get to meet their goal. And you can see this graphed over a number of days. So everybody is getting that. That is considered the core intervention, the app. What's being turned on and off are coaching sessions, whether somebody is getting 12 or 24, the reports to the primary care doc, whether they're not getting them or they are getting them, whether they're getting text messages or not. And what you see is that these designs are really quite powerful because you're testing main effects of each of these components, and you're using the entire sample in your test because half of the sample is getting the on level and half is getting the off level of each component. So when we actually do this experiment and we ask which components are contributing most to the 6-month weight loss and at what cost, we did a trial of 562 people. We looked at 6-month retention. It's actually a conservative way of presenting it, the proportion that showed up for their 6-month visit. And lo and behold, the only thing that wound up enhancing weight loss was training the buddy to be supportive. That was the only significant main effect. The other thing that bumped up the effect of buddy training was giving the report to the primary care doc. So the way it looks is that you're soaking up basically the educational individual competence building effect with your 12 coaching sessions. Adding 24 doesn't do anything more for you. But when you're building support into either the immediate interpersonal environment or the institutional one, you're getting a bump up. So we're not done yet. When we know the effects of those components, we still now need to assemble the intervention, and we're entering a decision-making phase here, where all of a sudden, we now need to worry about not just, are these components effective? Are they active? Do they have a reasonable effect size? Are they significant in terms of at least a trend? But we now start to get worried about costs, because what we want to be able to do is to build an intervention package that is scalable, meaning that it costs less than $500 to deliver. Where did we come up with that figure? Insurance companies tell us they're willing to pay that amount of money. So now we have to go back and do the assembling of the packages. And here is the information that we have to do that. We have 4 component packages that look like they might have legs. And there's a clear winner here. And it is that the 12 calls is sufficient. Why would you use 24? It costs twice as much and it doesn't add any benefit. Why would you advise people to use meal replacement? It's not producing any effect in this context. Or text messages, they don't do anything. But buddy training is effective. And if we're using buddy training, the primary care report adds to that. And what we get at 6 months is a little bit more than a 6-kilo weight loss, which is pretty substantial. And in fact, we get more than half of the sample achieving a clinically meaningful 7% weight loss, which is about what the diabetes prevention program got for $1,500 to $1,800, and it cost us $427. So that's quite an improvement in terms of scalability. And this is the intervention that we are now rolling out to patients at Northwestern who basically can afford $427, even if they didn't have insurance, but their insurance will pay that amount of money. But you're not always in a context that's as affluent as Northwestern. You might, for example, be in a federally qualified health center where you have an enormous population that needs obesity treatment, and you really just do not have very much money. You have still a different, pretty effective alternative. And this is actually the one that Angela is testing in her EVO trial. 12 calls, everything else is off. You still get about 1 kilo less weight loss, but half of your sample is achieving a public health meaningful weight loss, 5% weight loss. And this one costs you about $100 less. So if your optimization constraint is you want to be able to spread your scarce resources across more of the population, that's the way you would probably want to go. So just moving on then, we'll go, so that's sort of, that is your best average obesity intervention, depending on your context and your constraints. But again, we know that one size doesn't fit all. So how do we address that? We're now going to go to a smart design that tries to answer, okay, where should we start in terms of what we offer people? How long should we wait until we know if it's working or not? And what should we do? How much should we step up and augment if it's not working? So this SMART trial is one that I did with Billy Namshani, who you'll hear from later in the week. And we call this SMART Weight Loss Management. And this study had 2 aims. The first aim was to determine whether the optimal first-line treatment for a population of overweight and obese adults is mobile health alone, just the app, or mobile health plus coaching, the App+ coaching. And obviously, the App+ coaching is going to cost an awful lot more than just the app alone. But on the other hand, if it's essential, if, for example, if you get it wrong and you start with app and you can't rescue a person later, you can't bring them back, it might be a worthwhile investment. So it's an important question. The second question, the aim 2, was to determine whether the optimal response to early weight loss treatment failure is to modestly step up the person, add another inexpensive mobile health component like text messages, or to vigorously step up, adding a traditional weight loss component and another mHealth component. So the traditional weight loss components would be more expensive things like coaching or meal replacement. Now, what I have graphed up in the upper right-hand corner there is the the answer to the question of how long do we need to wait to figure out if the treatment is working. Ordinarily, in a SMART trial, you would need to figure this out first because you need to know when to start looking for whether the treatment is working. We had done a prior study for which you see the ROC curves up in the upper right-hand corner, showing that we could tell after 2 weeks how well a person was going to be doing in the weight loss, in response to weight loss treatment at 6 months. This was a great advantage because the tradition in doing stepped care obesity treatment has been to wait for 3 months. And that's a long time to be hanging in with a treatment that's not working. So it was a great advantage that we knew we could tell after 2 weeks. So here's what the design looked like. This was a trial of 400 people. We decided that we would interpret that somebody is responding to the treatment if they're losing at least a half a pound a week, which is considered a safe rate of weight loss. And we start by randomizing them to either get the app alone to start off with, or the App+ coaching. And we let them go along with that. And then we check at 2 weeks to see if they are losing an average of a half a pound a week. And if they are, we just continue them in whatever they started with. The app alone, if they started with that, the App+ coaching, if they started with that. If they're not losing a half a pound a week, we step them up. And what we're testing here is, do we step them up a little bit, modestly, or do we step them up a lot, vigorously? The modest step up for starting with app alone is to just add text messages. The vigorous step up is to add text messages plus coaching. On the other hand, if you were starting with App+ coaching, the modest step up is to add just texting. The vigorous step up is to add texting plus meal replacement. Now, it's important to notice that we don't just give people one opportunity to fail and then we stop paying attention to them. We give them 3 opportunities to fail. 1 at week 2, 1 at week 4, and 1 at week 8. They only get re-randomized once, the first time that they fail. We don't keep stepping them up. You could, it probably would be very sophisticated, but we don't do that. And then we stop the treatment at week 12 because this is a pilot, but we do measure weight loss at 6 months. So the first thing that we were interested in was to see, okay, which treatment is overall doing better? Is it the app alone? If you look at all the people who started out being randomized to app alone versus all the people who started out being randomized to App+ coaching, regardless of what happens to them after, who would you think would be doing the best? Well, my money would certainly have been on App+ coaching. I would figure, you're getting more of a leg up from the start, so surely more people will do well with that. And it was really not the case. About half of the people who got app alone at the beginning and half who got App+ coaching did fine. They didn't need an additional boost up. So that was a real shocker. Our hypothesis in this case was that we thought we would probably see an advantage, a weight loss advantage of offering App+ coaching as the initial treatment, but this was a non-inferiority design. And what we said is that from a population health perspective, yeah, you might see a significantly greater weight loss with App+ coaching, which indeed we did. But we said, look, if the difference between app alone and App+ coaching is not more than 5.5 pounds, we're going to consider that essentially the 2 treatments are equivalent. And from that perspective, App+ coaching and app alone are equivalent. So the answer would be, what should be your optimal first-line treatment? It would be app alone. as this balances the magnitude of weight loss against how much you're spending on treatment. And it sure as heck is a lot less expensive to not pay for coaches. We designed this as a stepped care intervention, but it's noteworthy that we actually found no difference between the modest and the vigorous step up. So although we designed this as a stepped care intervention, what I would conclude is that the most supported treatment from this is to, from a population health perspective, just give the app alone. No point stepping up. On the other hand, if we now move from a population health perspective to a clinical perspective, from a clinical perspective, I want to be able to help everybody who comes to my office, not just the average person. So my concern becomes, okay, yeah, we can see that if we start people with the app alone, they'll lose a little bit more weight, or a little bit less weight than the people who start with the App+ coaching. But the real worry is if I start them with app alone and I step them up to something, I re-randomize them, I can't get them back. I cannot produce anything like the amount of weight loss that we see in somebody who's been successful. I do pretty badly at bringing them back if I start with App+ coaching, but at least I can get sort of maybe a third, half of the weight loss benefit. So I worry about this ability to rescue non-responders when I put on my clinical hat. And so I think that the smart design gives us another place where we have information to make different choices. So for example, in a context like my Northwestern context, where I think that individuals or payers can afford to pay for meal replacement or giving people shakes or people buying their own shakes, I think there's some evidence in the data that we might want to think about starting with App+ coaching and adding meal replacement as a step up. Why do I say that? It's because if we look at either 6-month or 12-month weight loss, and we find people who are adherent to taking their meal replacement, their weight loss is as good as people who succeeded from the outset. So we can bring them back from the dead if we're willing to offer a more expensive step-up augmentation strategy. So once again, our most design gives us information that doesn't necessarily force a conclusion one way or the other. It leaves us with decision options that we can exercise. So my conclusion so far is that in smart weight loss, so if we look at our smart weight loss management trial, the 6-month weight loss was not inferior for people who began treatment with app alone as compared to App+ coaching. So starting with app is the optimal population strategy. And about half of those people who were treated with app alone showed an adequate weight loss, both initially and ultimately. Since it makes no difference for 6-month weight loss, whether we augment treatment after non-response, I would say one very conservative thing to say would be to add text messaging if somebody is non-responsive. But since we also know that's not having a significant benefit, I'm not sure that I see the reason for adding text messaging. So if we're talking about an optimal weight loss treatment algorithm for a population that's balancing impact and resource cost, it's the app alone as the first line treatment. But if we're talking about a clinical situation where we have few resource constraints, it may be the App+ coaching followed by meal replacement augmentation. Realize that something that we're doing in the smart design is that our ultimate treatment package it's not a single package, it's an algorithm. It's ideally an if-then algorithm. Start here. If it's working, keep doing it. If it's not working, step up. change it. So I think one thing that we like about smart designs is that they're adaptive. They're testing an algorithm, an if-then decision rule. It's a principle. So you're not sticking with the same thing if it's not working, which is what clinicians do in the real world. And what you're adapting to is treatment non-response. So it looks sort of like stepped care. Now I'll go to the last design I'm going to talk about, the JEDI, the one that capitalizes on the fact that people are not the same all the time. So what we're trying to figure out in a JEDI is what to observe to tell what kind of state or context they're in. What are these tailoring variables that tell us how we should be changing things? And what decision rules should we apply to respond to these variations in somebody's context and state? So I'm going to shift now from talking about obesity to talking about smoking cessation. This was a trial, this was a humongous multi-site trial that Santosh Kumar, who you'll also hear from later in the week, was the PI of, and it involved multiple institutions, I think maybe up to 15. Most of us involved in this intervention were either from Northwestern, and you see the co-Is from Northwestern here, or from University of Michigan, Billy Namshani and Susan Murphy, who you'll also hear from later this week. And here was the problem that we were trying to solve with this JEDI. It's really hard to quit smoking. Most attempts at quitting smoking, particularly if you're not getting an evidence-based treatment, most of them are going to fail quickly, 93% of them within the first week. Moreover, we sort of know what the pathway to a relapse looks like. If you have a slip, a puff, a few puffs, 95% of the time that's going to be followed by a full relapse. You're going to gradually work your way back up to where you started. We do all kinds of things to try to encourage patients to call us when they're tempted to smoke. We've done studies where we assign them to page us. They almost never do. So this has been a tricky problem. So how can we get a handle on something that will tell us that somebody is at risk of slipping or relapsing? Well, one thing we know is that stress precedes a lot of relapses to smoking, and a lot of smokers say one of the reasons they smoke is because of stress. And so it seems like stress sort of identifies a state of increasing risk of smoking. So, and the good thing is we actually have got some tools in our toolbox to do something about stress. We have various stress management exercises, we have relaxation training, we have mindfulness, got a bunch of things. And these things work. The problem is that people fail to use them. They don't sort of spontaneously pull them up and practice them when they need them. So the question that we asked in this study was, could we prevent smoking relapses by prompting somebody to engage in a stress management exercise? And the question that the study, the micro-randomized trial, was trying to answer in order to guide the JEDI is, when should we prompt them? Now think about that for a minute. Do you think you know? In fact, we really do not know. And when JEDIs go wrong, it's usually because we assume we know. I think most of us would assume that the time to intervene is, well, you know, stress is this heightened state of relapse. So you want to get in there right away to sort of put a lid on this vulnerability that's bubbling up. So you say you want to prompt them to perform the stress management exercise as soon as the stress occurs in order to contain this rising vulnerability and prevent the lapse. So that hypothesis would say you provide a prompt only when the person is under stress. But there's another way of thinking about it, which is that, I mean, just think about the kind of state of receptivity that you're in when you're under a lot of stress. You don't want to be asking me to do very burdensome things. When I'm under a lot of stress, steam will come out of my ears. So when we're under stress, our cognitive capacities are usually occupied with worrying about things, with just trying to manage. So we don't have an awful lot of capacity to pay attention, to reflect, to master new skills. We're not at our best. So an alternative hypothesis is maybe it's best to provide a prompt to practice stress management skills only when the person is not under stress, only when they can sort of rehearse and practice so that they get better at spontaneously pulling up these skills. And the fact is, we don't know the answer to that. So the micro-randomized trial is testing stress as a contextual dynamic tailoring variable that moderates the effect of the intervention. It says the intervention will work better under the condition of stress, or will work better under the condition of no stress. It's an interaction, it's a moderator. And we're doing this study to try to figure out a decision rule to guide the optimal timing of this stress management prompt. You can think of it like this. And this highlights another very unique feature of the micro-randomized trials. When you're thinking about clinical trials to test whether an intervention works, usually we're in a situation of we're randomizing people to get the good stuff, the intervention or the control condition. Here, everybody is being randomized multiple times because they're being randomized based on their state of being stressed or not stressed. So what you are randomizing is minutes. And these minutes are getting either no intervention or intervention. So if it's correct that the optimal time to intervene is when you're stressed, well, that's where you will see the best benefit. If it's the alternative hypothesis that the best time to prompt stress management is when you're not stressed, that's when you will see the best benefit. If you see no difference between these two, if there's no interaction, then it doesn't matter. You could push out the prompt to do the stress management intervention anytime. It doesn't have to be tailored. Then stress is not a good dynamic tailoring variable for this intervention. So what did this protocol look like? This was a quasi, sort of a treatment analog study. We started people in the lab when they were smoking. They came to visit us over a period of 4 days. We did the consent process. We trained them on the wearable sensors and the app we're going to have them use. We coached them in the process of quitting smoking, what to expect in terms of withdrawal symptoms, how to use these stress management apps that we're providing for them on the phone. And we do in-lab recording of their behaviors, eating and smoking. So we've got a record of what those things look like in terms of the data from the sensors. That goes on over 4 days. 4th day is the quit day. And now we send them out with their apps, with all their training, and we tell them, we hope that you will be able to stay smoke-free. We give them 10 minutes of coaching on day 5 and day 8. And at the end of day 15, we have them come back and return all the devices. This is what the setup looks like. The person is wearing wearable sensors. They're wearing a chest strap that is measuring respiration and ECG. They're wearing wristbands that are measuring motion and position. And here's the app that is telling them partly whether their sensors are connected, and it is prompting them with ecological momentary assessments. They're being asked to report when they smoked, when they're stressed. They're getting random prompts and event-triggered prompts, and the data are being processed. Sensor data are being processed on the phone in real time to classify every available minute as stressed or not stressed. Now, how do we know what stressed or not stressed looks like? Santosh has validated these algorithms in a laboratory context where he has had people do classic stressor tasks like stick your arm in a bucket of ice water, do public speaking, do mental arithmetic. They learn what the signals look like, and that's the algorithm that's being run to determine if the minutes are stressed or not. The other thing that is being run by the smartphone is the puff marker detection app. And that has been validated against, it's also sensory data or sensor data. It's been validated against self-reports and also a wearable camera that's giving ground truth for whether somebody is smoking. So sounds pretty straightforward, right? The minutes, the stressed or not stressed minutes, being randomized to whether this app opens on the phone to prompt them to engage in a stress management exercise. Well, here's what the design looks like. The sensors are picking up what's going on with them and around them in their context. The minutes are being classified as stressed or not stressed. If they can be clearly classified, the person is being randomized to get the stress management prompt or no prompt. But I'm going to call your attention to this sort of silo over here called available, because this becomes very challenging. This is where the challenge becomes when you're doing purely sensor-directed interventions. Your data are often messy, and sometimes it's hard to detect whether a minute is stressed or not stressed. And we also have considerations like safety. We don't want to be pinging somebody to do a relaxation exercise if they're driving. So we have a whole lot of logic under the hood of this intervention telling whether a minute should be randomized. Minutes that are not available are taken out of the queue in terms of being able to be randomized. And what are we taking as our outcomes? We're taking as a proximal outcome whether a stress episode occurs in the next 2 hours or how quickly it occurs, and whether smoking occurs in the next 2 hours and how quickly it occurs. What we're really interested in is the distal outcome of, does following this JEDI make a difference in whether somebody relapses within 2 weeks? That's what we really want to know. We can't test that until we have the JEDI algorithm that we can test in a randomized control trial against a control condition of nothing or something like randomized prompts. Availability, just to echo how challenging this can be, these are all of the decisions that are being made under the hood of this app to determine if somebody is available to have that minute randomized. How much missing sensor data is there? Is there physical activity? Because we really can't tell the difference between physical activity and stress. Can the stress episode be classified accurately? Can we say it's probably stressed or probably not stressed? What's the burden level look like? How recently did we bug the person with an EMA? How recently were they driving? So is it safe or not? Is there 10% of the phone battery left to let them engage in this mindfulness exercise? Well, at the end of the day, what we wind up doing is about 3 prompts per day, half of them when they're stressed, half of them when they're not stressed, and we balance these across morning, afternoon, and evening. And we try to work around the causes of missing sensor data, which can happen if the sensors get detached or if the Wi-Fi signal gets dropped. Once again, here are the outcomes we're interested in. How can we tell if the JEDI is working? Proximally, we see that there's less probability of a stress episode or less time to one, and less probability, less time to a smoking episode. And we'd like to see that stress as a mediator on the path to smoking lapse. Distal algorithm, or the distal outcome, of course, we can't test till we do an RCT. So just to wrap up, Um, the thing that I think is very exciting about the mHTI and about the work that you're all doing and going to be doing even more extensively is that I think technology-supported interventions are a tremendous boon because they help to expand the reach and reduce the burden, and they help us refine the tailoring of behavioral interventions. And they're also ideally suited to some of these new multi-phase optimization strategies and their research designs that can help us design efficient and effective intervention packages for the average person. We do that with factorial designs. We can use smart designs to address the fact that we know there is no average person. People are different. And they tell us what the sequence of things is that we should try and how long we should wait and how we should wean people off of treatment. And then finally, the most exotic, the micro-randomized trials that help us develop algorithms to know when to push out a just-in-time adaptive intervention that hits the sweet spot between somebody's vulnerability and their responsivity to interventions. So let me just stop and acknowledge my funders and my collaborators and my wonderful team, without whom none of this would ever get done. So thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. That was a fantastic talk. I love seeing how, how you do this whole course through all the steps.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful, beautiful work. I would like to open the floor to questions. Who's got questions? I have one while we're waiting. So this is a terrible cliffhanger. You didn't show us the results of the
Jedi?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, this is really. It took us 3 years to get the protocol paper written. Because it was so complex, just getting all of these decision rules was unbelievably complicated. Now we are in the process. Now I've handed it off to the analytics people.
Yeah.
And the truth is we have to develop some new analyses. There are no existing analyses that can answer.
I know, I'm going to talk about that. I know.
So it involves these issues like we have continuous predictors and trichotomous outcomes, and no analyses exist. So we are, I think we now actually have the analyses. We're still just finally cleaning the data set. I hope by the end of the summer, we will know where that is. All of these things are so much more complicated than my fantasy was before I went into the world of magic mobile health intervention.
If we'd known what we're getting ourselves into, we might have, owned horses. But
sounds good.
That's a great answer.
Well, then you'll tell us the answer.
Oh no, I'm going to make more questions, but yes, and it also took us 3 years to write the protocol paper for our MRT. Wow. It's impossible. Wow. Is it published yet or no?
Yes, and the amazing thing was, it is published in Contemporary Clinical Trials, which is the mainline clinical venue for publishing RCTs. And I'm so impressed with them. They put Angela on their editorial board. She couldn't review any of this, but they have the sense to recognize that they need to get out of the rigidity that has them only doing randomized controlled trials and not optimizing first. Oh, Angela's just put the.
Thank you, Angela.
But yeah, they ask the most thoughtful questions. And so I'm just very excited that the field seems to be developing a new openness.
I'm just wondering that, for example, like because the distal outcome, clinical outcome was 10 days. So I would just imagine that, for example, one person can get 2 interventions in 1 day. For example, it's a day that start with stress situation and get randomized to get intervention, And then later on, there was data the stress went away, but they happened to have another randomization and get another intervention. And I would just imagine that it could be difficult to tell, for example, 10 days from then, that whether the smoking or not smoking how was that related to?
That's why we make the distinction between the proximal and the distal outcome. With the proximal outcome, we're really only looking at what happens in the next 2 hours. And so presumably what's producing the odds that they relapsed or didn't relapse within the 10-day period, it's the summation of those proximal outcomes. But yeah, I mean, in any day, because they're getting 3 micro-randomizations, the maximum number of times that they're going to be exposed to the app is 3. And it's going to range between 0 and 3, which turns out to have been another thing that we needed to develop a new analysis to deal with, is the 0. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think that the more, not the self, but proximal outcomes is a fantastic idea. Thank you.
Yeah.
I see a question here from Jess McCurley to everyone. Can you speak? They congratulate you on the news about your local implementation of your work on your P50. Who's funding?
And see, it's moonshot funds.
All right.
Biden got another round of moonshot funds, so it's NCI moonshot dollars.
Fantastic. Can you speak a bit about what has been most powerful or most convincing to your local decision makers to sell them on sponsoring, implementing your health promotion work?
Oh, this is actually I just gave a master lecture at Society of Behavioral Medicine on this topic. And I think this has been such a long learning experience. I presented it as a game board, and all the things that were sort of, okay, move forward versus fail, go back. So many things. The major challenge is that the stuff that I do is considered prevention. Prevention is not taken seriously by the medical community. They want to treat disease. It's not real unless it's disease. So one of the things that I have learned to do is to present the risk behavior treatments that I do as not just prevention, because they worsen the outcome of the disease, they complicate treatment, they complicate diagnosis, and they augment the cost. Like obesity augments the cost of recovering cancer by $3,000 per year. Smoking augments it by like $6,000 per year, but there are less smokers. So I've stopped presenting it as just prevention. And just risk for the onset of a disease, I now present it as this is risk of a disease. And I present it to the hospital. I multiply the amount of money that they're losing by not treating these things. And I compute it on the basis of how many cancer patients are there in your 11 hospitals, Northwestern. I show you how much money you're losing and how much you could save if you dealt with this. And part of the tip-off for me about that was I had 2 very bizarre experiences over the several years that I was trying to sell this. And one was that the very first time I approached the hospital administration about selling this, I was wanting to do our interventions to the staff, to the hospital employees, figuring, surely they'll want to take care of those people. Not so much. What they were willing to do was they wanted to take our treatments and market us. They wanted to market us to Boeing and to the Four Seasons to offer these treatments. So the notions, when people are thinking about prevention, they're thinking you should make money, not save money. And they were so willing to go there that they were willing to market us, but not use us. And then the same thing happened again the next time I approached. And here I approached the head of quality improvement, and they were willing to market what we do to the corporate health folks, to folks who had a lot of money, a lot of time. But once again, they weren't willing to offer to the hospital. So we had to we had to really just, was money. It was money and the fact that that they would benefit and that it would benefit their bottom line. And you know, that's finally what did it.
Okay, another one here. This may be a simple question. Krista, have you learned yet that there are no simple questions? This may be a simple question. If I'm understanding the micro-randomized trial correctly, the randomization occurred based on whether that minute was considered stress versus no stress. Not quite, but okay. Can you randomize based on more than just that minute? I'm thinking, for example, with sitting time, instead of whether that minute was sitting versus no sitting, we might be more interested in whether the past 30 minutes or more were sitting versus no sitting. Is that possible?
Yes, and in fact, you know, in fact, that's sort of what we did. If you think, and that you're going to another very, very interesting complexity that I didn't realize at the outset of this. Donna knows about this. So, and this is one of the, it's a wonderful example of what happens when you try to do cross-disciplinary collaboration. So
this is my favorite story in all of science.
We as behavioral scientists, we want to randomize stress minutes as soon as the person is getting stressed. And so that's what we want to do. We want that sort of clinical urgency. The computer scientists who are trying to help us develop these algorithms, they want to make sure that we're only considering something a stress minute if it really is a stress minute, because they are much savvier than we are about how messy these data are. So when do you have the greatest certainty that something was stressed? It's at the end of the stress minutes. It's about when it's going to stop. So that's what they were doing. They were waiting till the end of the stress episode, which often goes beyond. It often can be like 4 minutes. That's when they were randomizing. Well, to us, that's basically the same thing as randomizing during a non-stress minute. So first we had to communicate well enough to be able to understand this disconnect. And then we had to reach a compromise, which was that we now consider something a stress minute if 2/3 of the way into the episode, it meets the criteria for being a stress minute. There's, you know, it's got less than half of the minutes are missing, that the sensors are attached, blah, 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 blah. So, but yes, we're talking about minutes, but actually sometimes it's going over a number of minutes.
Great question. Thank you for having Bonnie tell that story again. It is my favorite story in all science, but I think I said that. We are 1 minute over, and I could ask Bonnie a million questions, but that would be rude because you guys probably all want your 15-minute break. Oh, it's more than 15 minutes now. Now you get a whole bunch of break, right? You get an hour plus.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yes, so we will come back at noon my time, so 3 o'clock your time, in which I will absolutely confuse you further, because that's my job, and I'm sticking to it. We had a real pleasure this morning, Angela and Bonnie. You guys are amazing. Thank you so, so much. And what a great audience. See you in a little while, you guys. Enjoy.